The word sin holds for us all the fascination of the forbidden. Selfish, asocial acts do not attract us. But sin, that conjures up visions of loveliness, dancing there tantalizingly, just beyond the no trespassing signs. And yet, the concept of sin is not fashionable in today's society. We speak a great deal about guilt, but it's mostly guilt feelings, as though in some strange way we had guilt without sin. I believe there are only two groups which really take sin seriously. One is the fundamentalists, who are still with us, and the other is the existentialists. If we look back at the traditional meanings of sin in religious terms, we find two that are fundamental. There's first of all the idea of sin as transgression. Now this is disobedience to the will of God. And one can overcome this kind of sin by repentance, by saying I'm sorry, by works of penance perhaps, and by resolving to obey God actively in the future. The other sort is original sin. Original sin is what we're born in, and one can't get out of original sin, not at least without God's grace. What one has to do is to admit one's total unworthiness of having God's grace. So that, curiously, we are saved by faith from original sin, by the hope that we will be given what we have decided we don't deserve. In religious existentialism, the idea of sin, both original sin and sin as transgression, still makes sense, although the difference is that religious existentialists no longer feel that there is any clearly defined moral code there before us, or that we have any rational guarantee that we can ever be sure that we know God's will. For humanistic existentialism, the situation is more difficult, and some people declare flatly that it is perfectly meaningless to talk about good, evil, right, or wrong if there is no God to refer to. I remember that one time when I was talking about humanistic existentialism, someone in the audience said, "But if these people are right, is there any reason whatsoever why I should not go home and beat my wife?" But the existentialist would say that if the only reason this man does not beat his wife is because he fears or even loves God, then he is in sin whether he knows it or not. Why shouldn't he beat his wife? Well, because he loves his wife, or at least he esteems her as a human being whose joys and sorrows are as important as his own are. But I'll admit that there is a tremendous difficulty here. Dostoevsky said it in very strong terms, as he has one of his characters remark, "If God does not exist, then everything is allowed." If everything is allowed, does it make any difference whether we are good or evil? Or is it meaningful even to speak of the terms? Albert Camus, in The Myth of Sisyphus, declares that the concept of sin without God is one more manifestation of the absurd. In another of his works, The Plague, he raises the question, but this time in rather more positive terms. In one scene, his two principal heroes, Dr. Roux and Tarot, are talking together on the terrace, and Tarot asks Dr. Roux why, if he doesn't believe in God, he spends so much energy trying to cure men of the plague.
Do you believe in God, Doctor?
No, but what does that prove? I'm fumbling in the dark, struggling to find something out. But I've long since ceased finding that original.
May I ask you another question?
Yes, fire away.
My question is this. Why do you show so much devotion, considering that you don't believe in God?
If I believed in an all-powerful God, I would cease curing the sick and leave that to him. But no one believes in a God of that sort. No, not even the priest Panalu, who believes that he believes in such a God. And this is proved by the fact that no one ever throws himself on Providence completely. Anyhow, in this respect, I feel myself to be on the right road, fighting creation as I've found it.
So that's the idea you have of your profession?
More or less. You're thinking it calls for pride to feel that way. And I assure you I have no more than the pride that's necessary to keep me going. I have no idea what will happen when all this ends, or what's in store for me. For the moment, I know this. There are sick people, and they need curing. Now, later on, perhaps they'll think things over, and so shall I. What's wanted now is to make them well. I defend them as best I can.
Against whom?
I haven't a notion, Taru. I assure you, I haven't a notion. When I entered this profession, I did it abstractedly, because I had a desire for it, because it meant a career like another. Then I had to see people die. Do you know that there are people who refuse to die? Have you ever seen a woman scream, "Never," with her last gasp? Well, I have. And I saw I could never get hardened to it. I was young then and outraged at the whole scheme of things. I grew more modest. But I could still never get used to the idea of seeing people die. Well, after all...
After all?
After all, it's something that a man of your sort can understand most likely. But since the order of the world is shaped by death, mightn't it be better for God if we refuse to believe in him and struggle with all our might against death without once raising our eyes to the heaven where he sits in silence?
Yes. But your victories will never be lasting ones, that's all.
Yes, a never-ending defeat.
Who taught you all this, Doctor?
Suffering.
Dr. Rue has demonstrated for us the possibility of love and of responsibility without God. He finds that the solidarity of mankind is based upon the recognition of our common suffering, as though men stand together against a hostile universe. In later conversation, the two men are discussing this kind of metaphysical question or ethical question together once more. And this time, Taru raises the problem of evil not in the sense of suffering, but in a moral sense. He says that he has found that our society is permeated by an absolute evil. He is speaking not only of outright acts of criminal violence, but of what seems to him even worse, of men's attempt to justify evil. He speaks of political groups which rationalize murder, as they sacrifice some individuals for what supposedly is a struggle for a better state for all of mankind. And he speaks of that form of legalized murder, which society calls capital punishment. Taru finds himself weary of it all. It seems to him that this evil is indeed a pestilence among men, and he longs nostalgically for purity.
I know that each of us has the plague within him. No one on earth is free from it. I know, too, that we must keep a constant vigil lest in a careless moment we breathe in someone's face and fasten the infection on him. In this earth there are the pestilences and there are the victims. And it's up to us, so far as possible, not to join forces with the pestilences. No, I grant you we should add a third category, that of the true healers. But one doesn't come across many of them. And anyhow, it must be a hard vocation. That's why I've decided in every predicament to take the victim's part, so as to reduce the damage done. At least among them, I can hope for finding a path towards attaining to the third category, that is, to peace.
And do you have an idea of the road to follow for attaining peace?
Yes, the path of sympathy. It comes to this. What interests me is learning how to become a saint.
But you don't believe in God.
Exactly. Can one be a saint without God? That's the problem. In fact, the only problem that's facing me today. Another skirmish at the gates, I suppose.
Well, it's over now.
No, it's never over. There will always be more victims. That's in the order of things.
I suppose so. But you know, I feel more fellowship with the defeated than with the saints. Heroism and sanctity have never appealed to me. What interests me is being a man.
Yes, we're both interested in the same thing, but I'm less ambitious.
Dr. Roux and Tarot both want to live developing their highest potentialities as human beings. But Dr. Roux has chosen the path of service, whereas Tarot is still seeking some way of uprooting all of the seeds of pestilence within him. He wants to be a saint. But before we can ask the question whether, if grace is withdrawn, there can be saints without God, we must ask another question. Can there be sin without God? I think that there can. If one looks at the essential nature of sin, one finds that there is always somewhere the idea of a discrepancy, some sort of gap between what is set up as needing to be, that it ought to be, and what actually is. But man has within himself this discrepancy, this gap, this cleavage, this nothingness. For there exists a space, as it were, a psychic space, between himself and his projects, between what he is at any one moment and what he aspires to be. And out of this nothingness, there comes, of course, man's freedom. But out of this nothingness, too, comes the possibility of his sin. I believe that sin for the existentialist may exist in either of the two senses of which I spoke earlier. First, let's take the matter of sin as transgression. Sin as transgression here is no longer a broken bargain or disobedience. It is rather a discrepancy between the fact of man's freedom and the lie which he tells of himself. It is based upon cowardice, upon the rejection of an open future, upon a refusal to accept the human condition as what it is, a rejection which is based upon fear. The existentialists call this kind of sin bad faith. Bad faith tells a man that he is whatever his situation is, that he is absolutely and must be the role which he plays in society, usually a role which he feels has been thrust upon him. Bad faith tells man that he is determined, that he is not himself responsible, but that things from the outside have made him what he is and caused him to do what he did. When I speak of my relation to myself as being in bad faith, I am basically living what is called the unauthentic life. And unauthenticity is bad. It is bad because, in the first place, it is false. I am free and responsible no matter how much I might tell myself that I am not. Furthermore, it doesn't work. It's always a failure. For no matter how much I may try to pin down and glue down the wings of my consciousness, it will soar free at inconvenient moments, leaving anguish in its wake. Bad faith refers also to my attitude toward others. In bad faith, I try to say that a man is only what his situation is, what his color of skin is, or his religious background, or national background, or his education, or his social environment. And bad faith says that some men, by their natures, are superior to other men, and hence it justifies racism and oppression and religious prejudice. In bad faith, I am willing to sacrifice men for ends which they themselves have not chosen, as in political murder or as in war. In bad faith, I identify the existing standards of society with the absolute right and wrong that I pose. In bad faith, I assume that what may be simply society's expedient device to refuse, to avoid having to decide whether, after all, the values it places are the best values. I pretend that these standards or laws are somehow sacred and cannot be questioned. Bad faith is perfectly content to say that nonconformity is social crime. Bad faith is quite willing to have a discrepancy exist between theory and practice. Of all those who have denounced a society in bad faith, I think one of the most vehement and effective may be found in the work of Richard Wright. In his later years, Richard Wright was willing to identify himself openly with existentialism. But I would like to refer to an earlier work, Native Son. In a play which Wright and Paul Green based upon the novel called Native Son, we find a great trial scene where Bigger Thomas, a Negro, is being tried for the murder of Mary Dalton. But his defending attorney tries to show that in reality, it is not Bigger Thomas who is on trial. It is we, that is, society, and all of us.
Your Honor, when I took this case, I thought at first that it was the same old story of a boy run afoul of the law. But it is more terrible than that, with meaning more far-reaching. Where is the responsibility? Where is the guilt? For there is guilt in the rage that demands that this man's life be stamped out. Your Honor, I wish I could bring to you evidence of a morally worthier nature. I wish I could say that love, or ambition, or jealousy, or any of the more romantic emotions were back of this case. But I cannot. Fear and hate and guilt are the keynotes of this drama. You see, Your Honor, I'm not afraid to assign the blame, for thus I can the more honestly plead for mercy. I say that this boy is a victim of a wrong that has grown like a cancer into the very blood and bone of our social structure. Bigger Thomas sits there as a symbol of that wrong, and the judgment that you deliver upon him is a judgment upon ourselves and upon our whole civilization.
Your Honor, I object.
The court is still waiting for you to produce mitigating evidence, Mr. Max.
Farewell, then. Let us look back into this man's childhood. On a certain day, he stood and saw his father shot down by a Southern mob while trying to protect one of his own kind from hate and violence. Then Bigger Thomas fled north to this great city, hoping to find here a freer life. And what did he find here? Poverty, idleness, economic injustice, race discrimination, and all the squeezing and oppression of a ruthless world. It is that way of life that stands on trial today, Your Honor, in the person of Bigger Thomas. Like his forefathers, he is a slave. But unlike his forefathers, there is something in him that refuses to accept this slavery. Because through the very teachings of our schools, he was led to believe that in this land of liberty, men are free. With one part of his mind, he believed what we had taught him, that he was a free man. With the other, he found himself denied the right to accept that truth. Out of this confusion, fear was born. And fear breeds hate. And hate breeds guilt. And guilt, in turn, breeds the urge to destroy, to kill.
I object. All this is merely an attempt to prove the prisoner insane.
Objection overruled.
In this fear-crazed, guilt-ridden body of Bigger Thomas, a vast multitude cries out to you. Give us our freedom, our hope, and our chance to be men. Can we deny these cries? Can we boast through every medium of public utterance that this is a land of freedom and justice for all, and in our behavior tear these all down? Bigger Thomas sits as a symbol, an organism created by the political and economic hypocrisy of our time. We stand condemned before mankind. Your Honor, I beg you, not in the name of Bigger Thomas, but in the name of ourselves, Spare this boy's life.
The counsel for the defense may criticize the American nation and its methods of government. But that government is not on trial here today. Only one person, the defendant, is on trial. He pleads guilty. The rest is brief and simple. Punishment must follow. Punishment laid down by the sacred laws of this Commonwealth to protect that society and social system of which we are a part. A criminal is one who goes against those laws. Therefore, the laws must destroy him. The ruined, the rotten, and degraded must be cut out, cleansed away so that the body politic itself may keep its health. Yes, if the defense wishes, let us not speak in terms of crime, but in terms of disease. I pity this diseased and ruined defendant. But as a true surgeon looking to the welfare of the organic body of our people, I repeat that it is necessary that this diseased member be cut off and obliterated, lest it infect us all unto death. Bigger Thomas is sane and responsible for his crimes, and all the eloquent tongues of angels or men cannot convince this honorable court that it and I and the others gathered here are the guilty ones. Your Honor, in the name of the people of this city, in the name of truth and Almighty God, I demand that this Bigger Thomas justly die for the brutal murder of Mary Dalton.
Bigger Thomas, stand up.
Bigger Thomas was condemned to death, and for the moment at least, the jury persuaded itself that it was not on trial. Wright's novel and play are more than an attack on segregation, even more than a description of society in bad faith. I think it contains a suspicion of the existentialist original sin. Sartre, in his book Being and Nothingness, says, "Original sin is my upsurge in a world where there are others. My original fall is the existence of the other." Once again, we find that original sin contains a discrepancy. We live, we have to live, as if there were only one world, the same for everyone. But there is not one world. There are as many worlds as there are individual and independent subjectivities. In my daily life, I cannot avoid treating at least some men as if they were objects and thinking of them as such. But no man is an object. We are all subjects, and the world for us is the world which our own subjectivity experiences. There is no other. Again, I live and have to live in full responsibility for my acts, but this responsibility is accompanied by so terribly limited a knowledge, so that in a sense I must act responsibly and blindly. Paraphrasing the old catechism, we may say that every day I assault the other's freedom in thought, word, and deed. I may say that I do so for his good, but good from whose point of view? Even if it's for his own good. Still, if his own good is his own freedom, then I am the enemy. Our social structure is based on original sin, for no matter how enlightened, the majority does and must live at the expense of the minority. But there is no arithmetic by which we can add up human souls and justify this kind of attitude. We might get rid of political oppression and maybe capital punishment, but what about the old idea of a criminal who needs punishment? Can we justify this? There is salvation by works from bad faith. We may improve our conduct. But there is no salvation for original sin, if by this we mean that the saint may be cleansed of existential guilt and washed clean. In fact, sainthood may be the greatest temptation. For if a person actually shuts himself off from mankind and withdraws to preserve his purity, This is simply an avoidance of that responsibility which we ought to recognize. It is just as though one committed moral suicide by refusing guilt, as though one tried to escape God's judgment by killing himself. Does this mean that man is going to replace God? No. In fact, the greatest sin of all would be trying to take on God's absolute judgment, to sacrifice people because one pretended one could see the ultimate outcome. And again, it does not mean that we are to take on God's judgment. But there is one way in which the existentialist saint does choose to imitate God. The existentialist saint wants, like God, to be aware at every moment that an act is not the same to the man who performs it in the inward life as the same act is when judged from outside. And this realization is inevitably going to mean that we will try to cultivate God's forgiveness if we care to respond to the challenge. The existentialist saint, baptized in the sins of the world, wants to understand men, to accept them without condemning them, to help them without passing judgment upon them or living their life for them. He is saved by faith and the lovability of mankind. Thus we find that there are the same demands, the same temptation, the same challenge for the existentialist saint as for the traditional saints and religious heroes. But for him, there is no divine pardon, no grace, no paradise. His passion is not the reliving of the crucifixion and resurrection, but the reenactment of the original fall.
Self-Encounter was taken in part from the Literature of Possibility, a study in humanistic existentialism by Hazel E. Barnes, published by the University of Nebraska Press. The Plague by Albert Camus was translated by Stuart Gilbert and is published by Alfred A. Knopf Incorporated.
This is NET, National Educational Television.